In July of 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no apparent reason at all. She just danced. And she kept dancing for nearly 6 days straight, barely stopping to eat or sleep, until her feet were raw and bleeding. Within a week, 34 more people had joined her, and within a month, the number had climbed to around 400. Some of them danced until they collapsed. Some of them danced until they died. This is not a legend. It is one of the most thoroughly documented mass events in European history. City council records, physician notes, cathedral sermons, they all describe the same thing. Hundreds of people dancing against their will in the streets of a major city, and nobody could explain why. To understand what happened, you have to understand Strasbourg in 1518. The city had been devastated. A series of brutal winters had destroyed harvests across the Rhine Valley, and famine was widespread. Smallpox and syphilis were tearing through the population. The poor were literally starving in the streets, while grain prices soared beyond anything a laborer could afford. This was a community in crisis, spiritually and physically broken, with no safety net and no explanation for their suffering except divine punishment. The dancing started small. Frau Troffea was likely a woman at the edge of her endurance, and the historical record suggests her husband may have been abusive. Whatever triggered that first compulsive movement, it spread. Within days, neighbors and strangers were joining in, not by choice, but as though gripped by something they could not control. Witnesses described the dancers as terrified, weeping, begging for help, even as their legs kept moving. The city authorities did not know what to do, and their first response made everything worse. They concluded that the afflicted needed to dance the fever out of their systems, so they hired musicians. Guild pipers and drummers were brought in to play for the dancers. They even opened 2 guild halls and built a wooden stage so the dancers would have more room. The idea was that if they danced hard enough, the mania would burn itself out. Instead, the epidemic exploded. More people joined. The musicians played on, and the dying continued. It took weeks before the council reversed course. They banned public dancing, shut down the music, and sent the afflicted to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr who was believed to have the power to curse people with compulsive movement. The dancers were given blessed crosses, red shoes, and were led in rituals of repentance. Slowly, over the following weeks, the plague faded. By September, it was over. So what actually happened? Modern historians have largely ruled out ergotism, the idea that people consumed grain contaminated with a hallucinogenic fungus. Ergot poisoning restricts blood flow to the extremities, making coordinated movement nearly impossible, the exact opposite of what was observed. The dancers were moving with sustained, rhythmic energy for hours and days at a time, which ergot simply cannot explain. The most widely accepted explanation comes from the historian John Waller, who spent years studying the original sources. He argues that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon where extreme psychological stress manifests as real, involuntary physical symptoms across a group of people. This is not hysteria in the dismissive sense. The symptoms are genuine. The suffering is real. The body expresses what the mind cannot contain. What made Strasbourg uniquely vulnerable was the intersection of 3 forces. First, the population was under extraordinary stress, famine, disease, poverty, with no relief in sight. Second, there was a deeply held cultural belief that Saint Vitus could curse people with dancing plagues, meaning the template for this specific symptom already existed in people's minds. And third, once the first few people began dancing, it created a feedback loop of fear and suggestion. Seeing others dance made the terrified population more susceptible, not less. This was not the first dancing plague. Outbreaks had been recorded across the Rhine region for centuries, in 1374 in Aachen, in 1418 and 1428 in various towns. Each time, the pattern was similar: involuntary dancing, extreme distress, and eventual resolution through religious intervention. The 1518 outbreak in Strasbourg was simply the largest and best documented. The dancing plague forces a question that modern medicine still struggles with: where does the mind end and the body begin? We know today that extreme stress can trigger seizures, paralysis, blindness, and involuntary movements, all without any detectable neurological damage. The brain, under enough pressure, can produce symptoms that are completely real but have no physical cause. The people of Strasbourg were not faking, they were not possessed, and they were not poisoned. They were people in unbearable circumstances whose bodies found the only expression their culture had given them. 500 years later, mass psychogenic events still occur. Factory workers in Asia collapsing in waves, students in schools developing sudden tremors, entire communities reporting symptoms with no medical explanation. The mechanism is the same: extreme stress, cultural expectation, and the terrifying power of suggestion working together in ways we still do not fully understand. If this story pulled you in, we have more hidden chapters from history that most people have never heard of.